Now, you're a historian, obviously, but what sparked your interest in the life and I suppose the historical record of Richard III?
I think it was this huge disconnect between what we know about Richard from the contemporary sources written during his lifetime as Duke and King. And he died aged 32 on the Battle of Bosworth. So we have a lot of material about him. And all of the material talks about, who this man was. And he had a really good reputation both at home and abroad. And all the evidences show us that he was a man who was considered to be loyal, brave, devout, and just. And that's not to make him a saint. He was a medieval man, but you can see a very
Mm.
particular kind of man. But then when he dies, you then have all of the Tudor accounts of Richard, and they paint him as the sort of the monstrous, murdering tyrant that many of your listeners and readers will your many of your audience will recognize. And I think it was that disconnect between his lifetime and what the later writers said about him that really fascinated me, because I thought, why do we always talk about the Tudor version of Richard and never actually the version from his own lifetime, who the man was?
I think that's a very fair observation, and obviously you've been involved in this in a very long time. Can you please tell us about your involvement in helping to uncover his remains?
Yeah, so my search for the lost grave of Richard III began in 2004, 2005, and I eventually got the car park, the tarmac in the car park cut where my research and an intuition said his grave would be, and this was in August 2012. So my involvement was I led the search for Richard, and I was the client, and I received permission to cut the tarmac by the landowner and to undertake an archaeological dig, a ground penetrating radar survey, and I also brought a documentary film crew to film the search for Richard.
And you talk about your research and your intuition. Can you run us through some of that? Because obviously, there are those records there, but part of it is always going to be a bit of gut instinct, I suppose.
I guess, yes. I mean, the actual search for Richard began with an intuition, and it's a bit of a strange story because I walked into the northern end of this car park in Leicester, which was meant to be part of the very large Greyfriars Priory, where Richard had been buried in 1485. And in this particular place, I felt that I was walking on his grave. Sounds a bit strange now, and I can't explain it. But there was also a letter R painted on the tarmac for reserved parking, obviously. But that changed my research focus from his life into his death and his burial. But then all of the research that I then did together with a number of historians in a research project I put together called the Looking for Richard Project, it then showed that the northern end of that car park actually seemed to be where the church was, the choir of the church, and Richard III's burial. Because one of the big stories that is in all the history books that are published before 2012 is that Richard III was exhumed and his stone coffin became a horse trough, or he was thrown into the River Soar. And this is in all of the history books that you can see in 2012, but these were later stories with no evidential basis for them, but they'd been repeated and repeated and repeated over time until they'd become truth and fact. And I think that's why when I was going in search of Richard's lost grave in the car park in Leicester, I did receive quite a bit of ridicule for it because they kind of said, doesn't this woman know that he's not there and that he's in the River Soar? So I think what the Looking for Richard project told me was that you have to look at evidence. You have to be very critical in how you look at the information that we are given, particularly later stories.
Absolutely, because those later stories are obviously detached from what happened contemporaneously. But this has all been back in the media recently, an interesting piece in the Times. So what's the latest development in relation to Richard III, Philippa? Why has history been so wrong about him?
I think it's again that so many of our historians just believe the latest stories without any critical analysis and evaluation of the contemporary source materials. And I think this is what you've probably read about in the Times recently, because I put together, after Richard III was reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, I put together a new research project to look at the mystery of what happened to the princes in the Tower. These are the sons of King Edward IV of England, who was said to have disappeared from the Tower of London in 1483. And the Tudor stories are that Richard III had murdered them. So I thought, okay, we need to now do a critical examination of this mystery to see what we can find out. What we have found out, and this is 10 years of an international research project, we've discovered that the princes lived on, and we can see evidences of their continued lives into the reign of Henry VII. And they actually became two Yorkist claimants to the throne of Henry VII.
That's fascinating because, I mean, I'm all the way over here in Australia, but the story always was that Richard III murdered those boys in the Tower. That is actually fascinating. And in relation to Richard, are there still any more questions that are unresolved here? I mean, you've dealt with two very big parts of his life and how he is remembered in a historical sense. Is there anything else that needs to be resolved?
I don't think so. I think those are the two really big outstanding questions that we had about Richard. And I think this is why, it's changing everything that we know about him, because we now have his tomb monument. We now have him sort of returned to us, if you like, in Leicester Cathedral. But also, this was always the big crime that was laid against Richard by the Tudor chroniclers who were writing in the 16th century. And we've completely exposed that and blown it out of the water. So I think in terms of Richard, it's kind of done. But I think what we would need to do is maybe look again at the reigns of Richard III and Henry VII in light of this new information.
And what's your next project, if anything, you've got on the cards? Are there any other prominent figures in British history that you think which bear a closer look at?
Well, I think one of the projects that's in the pipeline is there's a search for Henry I in a car park in Reading that might come off at some point shortly. But I think in terms of Richard, I've got another project on the cards, which is really exciting, but I can't tell you anything else about that at the moment. In terms of looking into other historical figures, do you know what? I would say the Tudor monarchs, I would say that they need to all be really looked at again and reevaluated and critically, by not repeating their propaganda, but by actually digging deep and doing the deep dive into the materials from their reigns, because I still think there's untold stories there.
I think you're absolutely right. And if the work that you've done in relation to Richard III is anything to go by, I think there is still plenty for us to learn. Philippa Langley, thank you so much for your time.